The morning sun barely touched the dirt floor of the small cabin when Sarah's stepfather's heavy boots echoed through the room. At 9 years old, she had learned to recognize the sound of trouble approaching. The leather belt in his hand told her everything she needed to know about how this day would begin. "You worthless little rat," he snarled, his breath reeking of last night's whiskey. "Your mother's gone to town, and I'm tired of looking at your ugly face." Sarah pressed herself against the wooden wall, her small hands trembling as she tried to make herself invisible. But there was nowhere to hide in the tiny space that had become her prison since her mother remarried this cruel man 6 months ago. Her real father had died in a mining accident when she was 7, leaving her mother desperate and alone with a child to feed. The first blow landed across her shoulders, sending her tumbling to the floor. The second caught her across the back as she tried to crawl away. Each strike felt like fire burning through her thin dress, but Sarah had learned not to cry out. Screaming only made him angrier. "Please," she whispered, covering her head with her arms. "I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." But her stepfather was beyond hearing her pleas. The belt came down again and again until Sarah's world became nothing but pain and the taste of dust from the cabin floor. When he finally stopped, she lay curled in a ball, her body aching and her spirit broken. "Get out of my sight," he spat, throwing the belt onto the kitchen table. "And don't come back until your mother returns. I don't want to see your face again today." Sarah struggled to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. Every movement sent waves of pain through her small body, but she knew better than to disobey. She stumbled toward the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. Outside, the mountain air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the cabin. Sarah looked around at the thick forest that surrounded their home, located far from any neighbors who might hear her cries or offer help. Her stepfather had chosen this isolated place deliberately, she realized now. With nowhere else to go, Sarah began walking down the narrow dirt path that led away from the cabin. She had never been allowed to venture far from home alone, but today was different. Today, she would rather face the unknown dangers of the wilderness than spend another moment under the same roof as the man who had made her life a living nightmare. The path wound through tall pine trees and over rocky ground. Sarah's feet, bare and tender, soon began to bleed from the sharp stones, but she pressed on. The pain in her feet seemed minor compared to the aching in her back and shoulders where the belt had left its mark. As she walked, memories of her real father filled her mind. He had been kind and gentle, always ready with a story or a warm hug when she scraped her knee. He would have never raised a hand to her, never looked at her with the hatred she saw in her stepfather's eyes every day. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Sarah continued her journey into the unknown. She had no plan, no destination in mind. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to put distance between herself and the cabin that had become her personal hell. Hours passed, and Sarah's stomach began to growl with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening, and her small body was already weakened from the beating. But she pushed forward, driven by a determination that seemed too strong for someone so young. The path began to climb steeper into the mountains, and Sarah found herself breathing harder with each step. The thin mountain air made her dizzy, and more than once she had to stop and rest against a tree to keep from falling. It was during one of these rest stops that she first saw the smoke rising in the distance. A thin gray line against the blue sky. It spoke of warmth and maybe food. More importantly, it meant there was someone else living in these remote mountains, someone who might help her. With renewed energy, Sarah pushed herself away from the tree and continued climbing. The smoke seemed to beckon to her, like a beacon of hope in her darkest hour. She had no way of knowing whether the person who had lit that fire would be friend or foe, but anything had to be better than what she had left behind. The path grew narrower and more treacherous as she climbed. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, and She had to grab onto branches and roots to keep from sliding backward down the mountainside. Her dress, already torn from her stepfather's beating, caught on thorns and brambles, leaving long scratches on her arms and legs. But Sarah pressed on, driven by a hope she couldn't fully understand. Something deep inside her whispered that this journey, as painful and frightening as it was, would lead her to something better. She had to believe that, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the forest, Sarah finally crested a ridge and saw her destination. Below her, in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, stood a modest log cabin. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, and yellow light glowed warmly from its windows. The sight was so beautiful after her long, painful journey that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare might be coming to an end. But as she stood on that ridge, looking down at the cabin below, Sarah had no way of knowing that her real journey was just beginning. The man who lived in that cabin would change her life in ways she could never have imagined, and the path she had chosen would lead her far from the broken child she was today. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began the final descent toward the cabin, toward whatever fate awaited her in the gathering dusk of the mountain evening. The wooden porch creaked under Sarah's small feet as she approached the cabin door. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure whoever lived inside could hear it. Through the window, she could see the flicker of firelight dancing on log walls, and the smell of cooking food made her empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. She raised her trembling hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? How could she explain why a 9-year-old girl was wandering alone in the mountains, beaten and bleeding? Her stepfather's voice echoed in her mind, telling her she was worthless, that no one would want her around. Before she could lose her courage entirely, the door swung open. A tall man with weathered hands and kind gray eyes stood in the doorway, looking down at her with surprise and concern. His face was lined from years of mountain sun and wind, and his brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples. "Well, I'll be," he said softly, his voice carrying a gentle warmth that Sarah hadn't heard in months. "What brings a little one like you to my doorstep?" Sarah tried to speak, but no words came. The kindness in his voice, so different from what she was used to, made her throat tight with emotion. She stood there swaying slightly, exhaustion and hunger finally catching up with her. The man's expression immediately changed to alarm as he noticed her torn dress, her bleeding feet, and the way she held herself as if every movement caused pain. Without another word, he knelt down to her level, careful not to touch her, but keeping his voice gentle and calm. "My name is Daniel, but folks call me Dan," he said. "You look like you've had a rough time getting here. Are you hurt?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, broke through the wall Sarah had built around her heart. Tears began to flow down her dirty cheeks, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Well then, let's get you inside where it's warm," Dan said, standing slowly and stepping back to give her room. "I've got some soup cooking that could use sharing, and we can take a look at those cuts on your feet." Sarah hesitated at the threshold. In her experience, kindness from grown-ups always came with a price. But the warmth from inside the cabin felt like a hug after the cold mountain air, and the smell of food made her dizzy with need. Dan seemed to understand her hesitation. "Tell you what," he said, settling into a chair by the door. "Why don't you come in and sit by the fire, and I'll stay right here where you can see me. You don't have to tell me anything until you're ready." Something in his patient tone convinced Sarah to take that first step inside. The cabin was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts draped over the chairs. A fire crackled merrily in the stone fireplace, and a pot of something delicious bubbled on the wood stove. Sarah chose a spot on the floor by the hearth, as far from Dan as possible while still enjoying the fire's warmth. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as she could. Dan kept his promise, staying in his chair by the door while he ladled soup into a wooden bowl. "This is rabbit stew," he explained as he set the bowl on a small table near her. "Made it fresh this morning. There's cornbread, too, if you'd like some." The smell of the stew made Sarah's stomach growl audibly, but she didn't move toward the food. In her stepfather's house, eating without permission meant punishment. Dan noticed her hesitation and seemed to understand. "It's yours," he said simply. "No strings attached. A growing child needs good food." Still, Sarah didn't move. Dan tried a different approach. He ladled soup into his own bowl and began eating, making appreciative sounds. "My grandmother's recipe," he said between spoonfuls. She always said the secret was letting the vegetables cook slow and easy. The casual conversation helped ease some of Sarah's fear. When Dan got up to add wood to the fire, she finally reached for the bowl. The stew was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, rich with tender meat and vegetables. She tried to eat slowly, but her hunger won out, and soon the bowl was empty. "There's plenty more," Dan said, already reaching for the ladle. This time Sarah didn't hesitate to accept the second helping. As warmth from the food and fire began to chase away the chill in her bones, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected host. Dan moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, tidying up while giving her space to eat. When he did speak, it was about simple things like the weather or the animals he'd seen that day. "Found fresh deer tracks by the creek this morning," he mentioned while washing his own bowl. "Big buck from the looks of it. Been trying to spot him for weeks now." Sarah finished her second bowl and set it down carefully. For the first time in hours, her stomach wasn't cramping with hunger. The simple act of being fed without having to beg or earn it felt like a miracle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dan looked up from his work and smiled. "You're very welcome. Now, how about we take a look at those feet of yours? I've got some clean bandages and salve that'll help with the healing." Fear flickered in Sarah's eyes again. Her stepfather had always claimed he was helping her too, right before he hurt her. Dan saw her reaction and immediately backed away. "Or maybe you'd rather do it yourself," he suggested. "I can show you where the supplies are, and you can tend to your own wounds. Sometimes that feels safer." The fact that he understood her fear without her having to explain it made something tight in Sarah's chest begin to loosen. She nodded, and Dan showed her to a small wash basin where she could clean her cuts. The warm, soapy water stung at first, but it felt good to wash away the dirt and blood from her long journey. Dan provided clean rags and a tin of healing salve, then retreated to give her privacy. As Sarah carefully bandaged her feet, she heard Dan moving around the cabin, preparing something. When she emerged from the washing area, she found that he had made up a pallet by the fire, complete with soft blankets and a pillow. "Thought you might be tired after your journey," he explained. "This spot stays warm all night, and you'll be able to see the whole room from here. Sometimes it's easier to rest when you can keep an eye on your surroundings." Once again, his understanding of her unspoken fears amazed her. Sarah approached the makeshift bed cautiously, running her fingers over the soft wool blankets. She couldn't remember the last time someone had prepared a comfortable place for her to sleep. "I don't have to go back, do I?" she asked suddenly, the question bursting out before she could stop it. Dan was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody's going to make you go anywhere you don't want to go," he said finally. "Not while you're under my roof. But come morning, we might need to figure out what's best for you long term. Right now, though, you just need to rest and heal." Sarah crawled under the blankets, surprised by how soft and warm they were. The fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. "Dan?" she called softly as he prepared to bank the fire for the night. "Yes. Are you going to hurt me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the pain and fear that had driven her to his door. Dan was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she had said something wrong. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with sadness. "No, child, I'm not going to hurt you. Nobody should ever hurt a little one like you. And I'm sorry that someone did." As Sarah drifted off to sleep by the warm fire, surrounded by kindness for the first time in memory, She had no idea that the man watching over her had once been a father himself. She didn't know about the son he had lost or the wife who had left him brokenhearted in these lonely mountains. All she knew was that for tonight, she was safe, warm, and fed. And sometimes when you're 9 years old and the world has been nothing but pain, that's enough to feel like a miracle. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah first stumbled onto Dan's porch, and the transformation in the young girl was remarkable. The constant fear that had shadowed her eyes was beginning to fade, replaced by something Dan hadn't expected to see so soon: curiosity about the world around her. Each morning, Sarah would wake to the smell of pancakes and bacon cooking on Dan's wood stove. She had learned that Dan always rose before dawn to tend to his small herd of cattle and check his animal traps, but he never left the cabin until she was awake and had eaten breakfast. "Can I come with you today?" Sarah asked one morning as Dan prepared for his daily rounds. She had been asking the same question for a week, and each time Dan had gently explained that the mountain terrain was too dangerous for someone so young. But today, as he looked at Sarah's hopeful face, Dan made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I suppose you're old enough to learn about ranch work," he said, reaching for a spare coat that would fit her small frame. "But you have to promise to stay close and do exactly what I tell you." Sarah's face lit up with joy. In all her 9 years, no adult had ever trusted her enough to include her in important work. She nodded eagerly and pulled on the warm coat, practically bouncing with excitement. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Dan led Sarah to a small corral where 3 horses waited for their morning hay. "This here's Thunder," Dan said, patting the neck of a large black stallion. "He's my main riding horse. Been with me for 8 years now." Sarah watched in fascination as Dan moved among the animals with easy confidence. The horses clearly trusted him completely, nuzzling his hands and responding to his quiet voice. "The brown mare is Penny, and the gray one is Cloud," Dan continued. "Would you like to help me feed them?" Sarah nodded, and Dan showed her how to distribute the hay and check the water troughs. As they worked together, Sarah began to understand that Dan's daily routine was about much more than just taking care of animals. It was about responsibility, patience, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from honest work. "Why do you live up here all alone?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the pasture where Dan's cattle grazed. Dan was quiet for several minutes, and Sarah worried she had asked something too personal. But finally, he spoke, his voice soft with old pain. "I wasn't always alone," he said. "I had a wife once and a little boy named Tommy. He would have been about your age now." Sarah looked up at Dan's weathered face and saw a sadness there that matched her own. "What happened to them?" "Tommy got sick one winter," Dan explained, his eyes focused on the distant mountains. "Fever took him before we could get him to a doctor in town. My wife, she couldn't bear to stay here after that. Too many memories," she said. She went back east to live with her sister. "Do you miss them?" Sarah asked. "Every day," Dan admitted. "But I've learned that missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. Tommy would want you to keep taking care of the animals, keep this place running, and maybe sometimes help other folks who need it." As they checked on the cattle, Dan began teaching Sarah about ranch life in earnest. He showed her how to tell if an animal was sick, how to mend a broken fence, and how to read the weather signs in the clouds and wind. "A good rancher pays attention to everything," he explained as they repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. "The animals depend on you to notice when something's wrong." Sarah listened carefully to every word, absorbing the lessons with an intensity that surprised Dan. She had a natural way with the animals, approaching them calmly and earning their trust quickly. As the days passed, Sarah became Dan's constant companion. She helped with morning chores, learned to milk the cow, and even began helping with the cooking. In the evenings, Dan would teach her to read using an old Bible and some worn books he had kept from Tommy's childhood. "Education is important," Dan told her as they worked through a particularly difficult passage. "Knowing how to read and right opens doors that staying ignorant keeps closed. Sarah had never been to school. Her stepfather had claimed there was no point in educating a girl. But under Dan's patient instruction, she began to discover the joy of learning. Soon she was reading simple stories aloud by the firelight, her confidence growing with each successful page. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. What's going to happen to me when winter comes? Dan set down the harness he had been mending and looked at the girl who had become so important to him. In the weeks since her arrival, she had filled an emptiness in his life that he hadn't even realized was there. Well, he said carefully, I've been thinking about that. Winter in these mountains is hard, and I don't know if it's fair to ask you to stay in such an isolated place. Sarah's heart sank. She had begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a permanent home. Where would I go? There's a family in town, the Millers, Dan explained. They've got children of their own, and Mrs. Miller has been looking for help with the younger ones. They're good people, and they make sure you got proper schooling. But I don't want to leave, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I like it here. I like taking care of the animals and learning to read and helping you with the ranch work. Dan felt his heart clench at the pain in her voice. The truth was, he didn't want her to leave either. In caring for Sarah, he had rediscovered a sense of purpose that had been missing since Tommy's death. Sarah, he said gently, if you stayed here, it would just be you and me miles from the nearest neighbor. No other children to play with, no proper school. Are you sure that's what you want? Sarah looked around the cabin that had become home, at the warm fire crackling in the hearth, at the man who had shown her more kindness than anyone in her entire life. I'm sure, she said firmly. This is where I belong. That night, as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows, Dan made a decision that would bind them together as family. He began the legal process of adopting Sarah, giving her not just a home, but also his name and his protection. The paperwork took months to complete, but by the time spring returned to the mountains, Sarah Miller, for she had taken Dan's last name, was officially his daughter. She had learned to read fluently, could handle most of the ranch chores on her own, and had grown strong and confident under Dan's loving care. Years later, when Sarah was grown and had children of her own, she would often tell them about the day she walked up that mountain path, beaten and broken, and found the man who would become her father. She would tell them how love could heal even the deepest wounds, and how sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. Dan lived to see Sarah graduate from the Teachers College in Denver, marry a good man who respected her strength and intelligence, and raise 3 children who called him Grandpa Dan. He died peacefully at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had never expected to have again. At his funeral, Sarah stood beside his grave and read a passage from the Bible he had used to teach her to read. Through her tears, she thanked him for seeing past the broken child she had been to the woman she could become. The old cabin still stands in the mountains, now home to Sarah's youngest son and his family. A new generation of children plays in the pastures where Sarah once learned to care for cattle, and the legacy of kindness that began with one man's decision to open his door to a desperate child continues to this day. Sometimes when the wind blows just right through the pine trees, visitors to the ranch say they can hear the sound of a little girl's laughter, free and joyful, echoing through the mountains where love conquered fear and a broken heart learned to heal by healing another.